Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
It's not often that Britain's farmers make the news, but when the price of milk became cheaper than the price of water, something was bound to give. And Britain's farming community, hitherto stoic, undemonstrative, British, started acting like, well, the French.
They cleared the shelves of Asda and Morrison's and started to give the milk away in the car parks and charities. Some big heifers even made it into the supermarket aisles.
Joining us now is Britain's top woman farmer and deputy leader of the National Farmers Union, the NFU, Minette Batters. Minette, let me say first and foremost, you're the first farmer I ever met in my entire life. I spent almost 30 years as a Member of Parliament. I never met one person from the NFU. And I already know that if I had, I'd have been more informed about agricultural issues than I now am. Start us off by telling us about this crisis in the agricultural community.
For dairy farmers, I think there is massive frustration. You saw the protesting, it's been ongoing, people going into stores, emptying shelves. It takes years, generations to build a herd of cows. Investment in dairy farming is massive. Probably one of the greatest investments goes into dairy farming. So when you see a product being used as a loss leader over the number of years that milk has been used as a loss leader, I think things are now at boiling point. You know, farmers cannot go on producing milk at below the cost of production.
Well, I understand why the supermarkets want to use milk as a loss leader, and that's fair enough. No one complains about that, least of all the consumer. But the price should not be paid by the producer, should it? I mean, if it's a loss leader, it's the supermarket that should be taking the loss.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And when you use it as a loss leader, I think the damage you do to that supply chain is massive. And that's what we're seeing now. You know, we need a supply chain that is transparent, that functions. You know, effectively, we're paying the same for milk now that we were in 1982. You know, you were paying 20p a pint in 1982. You can now buy a litre, effectively 4 pints, for 80p. 1982, 33 years ago, you know, that's a real sign of why things are not working now and why that supply chain isn't working.
Is it just about loss leading? Is there overproduction? And if so, how? Why?
There is definitely, I think, a global problem with overproduction. I think a lot of emphasis was put on the Chinese market. That just isn't there like the world thought it was going to be. But you have to remember that we are an island nation. We have 65 million and rising to feed. And we can be wholly self-sufficient in milk and milk product. And I would say as a small island nation with pretty much the largest population in the EU, we actually should be aiming for self-sufficiency in milk and milk products.
It's been reported that the sanctions on Russia, for example, helped drive down demand and therefore give us some oversupply. But isn't it that people don't take seriously enough the issues that affect the rural communities in general, agricultural communities specifically, and they just don't have the political muscle to impact on governmental and corporate decision-making?
I think you're right, and I think we have suffered from several governments who have not taken food production seriously. We have not had food at the heart of government, British food, which we should have. You have to take on board health, education, food, farming. You know, they should all be intrinsically linked. You know, we waste more food than any other country in the EU.
We do, yeah.
Our levels of education, our understanding of food and where food comes from, you know, that is one of the lowest levels in the EU. So I really think it's not about farmers wanting government handouts. It's about wanting an enabling environment and actually having government departments that are working together. And I get enormously frustrated that politicians haven't prioritised food. You know, we're only ever 3 meals away from all-out civil war, basically. So I think where we can be self-sufficient, people want to be able to buy out of a global food larder, but there are areas where we should absolutely be aiming for self-sufficiency, and milk and dairy products is one area.
If I were running the NFU, and I'm glad you're now at the top of it, or near to the top of it, I would conflate the interests of the consumer and the producer. I would say, as you've just put it very succinctly, we're only 3 meals a day away from riot. So the mistake might have been for farmers to talk farming speak and talk producer speak always, rather than making their obvious allies amongst the people, particularly younger people who are very interested in food. I know in our house, there's always food programs on the TV, whether it's Come Dine With Me or looking back at what it used to be like. Unfortunately, I remember it, eating in the 70s, eating in the 80s, and so on. So it's not that we've got a public which is not interested in food. We've got a public that's probably more interested in food than it's ever been. Yeah. But somehow, the producers and the consumers haven't quite knitted together.
I think you're absolutely right. And I sit on the London Food Board, and that's a great way of engaging with sort of new food policy influences. And we have to do it. I get very frustrated at the lack of understanding with school children of food production. I've had school children out on my farm, and they just love it. They love knowing how food is produced, watching a seed grow, the very, very basics. And I think that we are in danger sometimes of overcomplicating it and making it too difficult. Whereas actually, if you give a good understanding of the basics, you know, we've now got food as a GCSE, and sadly, the vital link with primary production is missing. You know, that needs to be in there with the food GCSE, so that you have primary production in there as well. There's no point in learning about food if you don't understand the production process.
So does it mean you get, you know, schools visiting your farm?
Yes, absolutely.
Is that common, or just you?
No, it's something I think that many farmers feel absolutely passionately about. They love getting school children out on farm. Of course, you know, modern day and age, it's pretty difficult. You know, farms at the end of the day are workplaces, but it's very important, even to get the farm into the classroom, which is maybe more achievable for many. We're certainly, as an NFU, we're involved with inner London schools, getting them out on farm, getting a chef in, and just showing them the basics.
Minette, I understand that you're the first woman to be on the top of the Farmers Union, and you're also the 5th generation in your family to work in farming. Now, I myself am a city girl, but I have worked with farmers before in the east of Indonesia, called the Moluccas, and I've worked with both men and women farmers. You know, the whole family is involved. And how is that in Britain? How unique is your position as a woman's farmer here?
I think women are, and probably always have been, the backbone of many businesses. I know my own mother was very involved in our business.
It is really family business, yeah?
They are family businesses, yeah, they really are. And although our farm now is very different to what it was when my father was farming it, it's had to move with the times. It's a very different business now. But it's very much a team effort, and all of us, you know, pulling together, working together.
The point that you make raises an obvious question, that is it a zero-sum game? Is food self-sufficiency in Britain and more protection in one way for British agriculture and a commensurate loss to countries in the developing world, like Indonesia, for example? You mentioned the global food basket earlier. To what extent can we achieve an equilibrium, and a fair one, between the international farmer and the domestic farmer, and allow the consumer to make the kind of choices that we would all want to be able to make?
I think there are enormous global pressures on food. There are only 3% of farmers in the world. So there is 3% producing food for the 97%. Wow. It's a pretty profound statistic. And, you know, it's not really in any government's interest to have high food prices. but we want sustainable farming businesses across the globe. So I'm part of the World Farmers Organization, and I think it's really important that that 3% actually works together. You know, we have to have the whole issue of climate change, of water resource, of food security, and there's only 3% of us to do it. So we want to be able to source out of that global larder, but we want sustainable businesses across the globe too. So there is an element of us actually working together in the EU, but also across the world to maintain sustainable businesses and have a level, you will have heard of the Fair Trade Agreement, you know, actually producing to effectively a living price. You know, we've heard of, obviously, the living wage, which we all support, absolutely want people to be able to afford a better way of life, have a living wage that is relative to that. But you've got to have a living price that is relative to that as well.
Last question then. I mentioned in the introduction some rather un-British, quite militant tactics by the dairy farmers, which I personally think was a masterstroke. Got you onto our show, that's for sure. Are farmers becoming so cross that we might see the kind of things we often see across the Channel in France?
I think they are incredibly frustrated, they're angry, they are frightened, actually, because many of them, dairy farmers, they are struggling to, you know, put food on the table, maintain their businesses, and they want to drive those businesses forward. Huge investment in those businesses. So I hope we don't see too much disruption in stores, because that is our marketplace. Those are our consumers. We want to keep them on board, but we do want them to understand, I think, that the plight of dairy farmers. So being able to go out, buy British, look out for that red tractor logo and buying British dairy produce. And right across the board, you know, the red tractor is a sign of an independently audited supply chain. And you've only got to look back to things like Horsegate, when we had supply chains that were tampered with. And I think it really was a wake-up call to an island nation. Actually, you know, supply chains matter. And when it says 100% on the packet, Horsegate proved that it wasn't. So valuing our UK supply chains, which the red tractor is an endorsement of that, is very, very important. That's what we'd like the public to do.
Red tractors sound good to me. Thanks. Minette Batters of the National Farmers Union.
Coming up after the break, all things Tony Blair. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. He's back, Tony Blair. He's plastered all over the British media, warning Labour that it faces annihilation if it doesn't take his advice on who its next leader should be. Blair and Alistair Campbell apparently have a dossier on it, swept it off the internet floor. It could all happen in 45 minutes, apparently.
The killings of Tony Blair is imminent. The movie, I mean. And the parents of some of the children Blair sent to their deaths have given Chilcot a 2-week deadline to name the date for his inquiry report, or legal action will follow.
It's all coming to a head for Tony Blair. Joining us now to pull all these threads together is political analyst James Randolph, who also is working on the Blair documentary. James, thanks for coming on the Sputnik. Let's start with the most up-to-date news. The families of some of the slain British soldiers killed in Iraq have warned Chilcot, if he doesn't name a date within a fortnight for the delivery of the Chilcot inquiry report, they're going to court. This is beginning to heat up, isn't it? It's beginning to sharpen up.
Well, there's been 3 changes of government since the Chilcot inquiry was first launched. Blair has managed to draw out and delay and use every tactic he can as a barrister to draw this out into his own interests. But regrettably, it's taken the families of dead servicemen to actually have to threaten legal action to bring this to a head is
You see,
terrible.
David Cameron keeps saying, you know, it's independent. He's not in control of when it reports. But, of course, it's the taxpayer that's paying for it. It's cost many millions. I don't know how many millions. It's taken all these years, 3 parliaments. And he keeps turning down government offers of additional staff to speed the whole process up. David Cameron can't really wash his hands of this forever, can he?
No, he can't distance himself from it either. It must be there's protection of senior civil servants and officers within the Ministry of Defence who have interests in this. There's no reason for this to have taken so long.
Does all this mean, do you think, that what is eventually going to come is more devastating, or are they delaying it because it's not going to be nearly as devastating as the public is expecting?
It's mainly to do with the Maxwellisation of documents and correspondence that took place between the White House and number 10 Downing Street at the time. What we found in monitoring all of this at the Blair Doc is that Blair has used every delaying tactic that he can. It's clear as day.
Strings around them, but I suppose my question is, why? Is it because we're all going to be disappointed with the Chilcot report, or is it because the Chilcot report is going to be even more damning than perhaps we anticipated?
We've had our doubts about the makeup of the panel of the Chilcot inquiry from the get-go.
Some of whom have died in the process.
Exactly. I mean, this is crazy. People have died and, you know, there's been 3 changes of government. But Cameron cannot use this as an excuse any longer. He really has to. And when you have the families of dead service personnel...
That'll concentrate the mind wonderfully.
It will focus them.
I did make the point that Blair's everywhere. I mean, for the documentary, it's terrific. Not so good for those who've got to stomach him on every screen, on every front page. He's now intervened in the Labour leadership contest with an apocalyptic attack on Jeremy Corbyn, saying that it would be effectively the destruction of the Labour Party to choose the man that seems almost certain now to be chosen. What does that tell us? You
used his words, annihilation. Other words that have been described, ascribed to people who supported Mr. Corbyn are morons and other forms of...
People who need a heart transplant if their heart is with him.
Do you know, this is a political debate. If the Labour Party had focused on attacking the government with such gusto, where would it be? Where would we be? But
how does he imagine that this plays? I mean, that's something we'd need to get into his head to fathom, I suppose. But, I mean, I'm wondering, does he really think that anybody in the Labour Party is going to change their voting intention because Tony Blair asked them to?
It's ironic that he held his presentation for Progress the other week at the Institute of Chartered Accountants in the city, whereas previously a Labour leader would have held it at a trade union or a friendly organisation, but the Institute of Chartered Accountants was just crazy.
He's quite friendly with accountants. I can assure you.
Found out. Yeah. Every time he speaks, Blair doesn't seem to realise that there are another 10,000 members of the Labour Party who are prepared to join every time he attacks Jeremy Corbyn. It's absolutely crazy. He seems so out of touch.
That's one thesis, and it might be right, that he's simply mad, swivel-eyed, unhinged, or there may be method in this madness. I'll tell you my theory. It is this, that unhinged as it was, Blair's latest intervention is a Limehouse Declaration. For those not old enough to remember, the Limehouse Declaration preceded the split out of the Labour Party by the then right wing into the formation of the SDP, the Social Democratic Party, which eventually ended up in the Liberal Democrats, but kept Mrs. Thatcher in power for a decade. I don't believe that Blair or Straw or Campbell would be talking in the apocalyptic language that they are if they intended to remain in the Labour Party in the event of a Corbyn victory. So I think that what we are beginning to see here now is an historic cleavage, a second one, the first one being in 1982, a historic cleavage, which will lead to Blair leading his own party. That's my Thoughts? What do you think?
Well, if he did, many of his acolytes would have to leave the private industries that they've gone into. So they've gone into the private healthcare market, they've gone into munitions companies and arms suppliers. So it would be interesting to have them come back into mainstream politics. And of course, David Miliband, his protege, is in New York working for the International Rescue Committee.
There's a thought. Will he come to the rescue of the Blairites?
How ironic would that be?
Yeah, might he return to Britain to lead this new breakaway formation?
Well, he'd have to give up a massive salary in excess of £300,000 a year. He would have to give up a lot of privilege that he's got in his position in New York.
The establishment can fund that. Boris Johnson gets more than £300,000 a year for writing one column in the Daily Telegraph. Right. So they can find a way of feather bedding the re-entry of these people. If it happened, how do you think they'd do? The Corbyn Labour Party now has 610,000 members, wow, which is almost triple what they had before the last general election, which was only 3 months ago. Yeah. How many members do you think Blair could take with him? How would they prosper in the electoral game, do you think?
Well, they've played political brinksmanship all along. Corbyn was a token candidate up for the left just to show that there was a democratic process within the party, and it was going to be a procession for Blair's choices of Liz Kendall or Andy Burnham. But they were all on the far right of the party. Whether Blair will bring his magic, his black magic, if you like, back to the Labour Party, we can only guess. But at the moment, he seems to be failing on all fronts. The difficulty for us at the Blair Doc, of course, is that it means
keeping up with all this.
It's rewrite after rewrite after rewrite. We've got the central story.
He's the gift that keeps on giving, which is a problem if you're making a movie about him, because, hey, if we'd finished it 6 months ago, think how much we would have missed. Exactly. But it is on the editing table now, so pretty imminent. Certainly before Chilcot. In fact, everything in life is going to be before Chilcot at the current rate of progress.
For sure.
On the subject of the Labour leadership, it's now looking that Corbyn's going to win a victory so big that no one can seriously question it. They can't say that it's Trotskyite infiltration or Daily Telegraph Tories.
It's also too late to stop it, yeah?
And it's too late to stop it, and it's too big to stop. Yeah. You know, when you've marched 610,000 people to the top of the hill, you're not going to be able to march them down again. Yeah. We may be looking at a Jeremy Corbyn victory with perhaps 70% or more of the vote, perhaps 3/4 of the members voting for Corbyn. I missed all that, didn't you? I've spent my whole life working for this, but I never imagined that such a sweep, such a swell could take place. How surprising is it to people on the left for a long time like you?
It's groundbreaking. It's absolutely and utterly wonderful, but breathtaking in light of the recent election results, which saw Scotland return one Labour candidate. If that message hasn't gone out, that a traditional Labour heartland like Scotland has lost a generation if they don't take preventative or measures right now in restoring it through someone like Jeremy.
How many Corbynites are there in Scotland, by the way?
The SNP would say that they've taken the core Labour vote because they've taken everything Jeremy's been wearing for years.
Yeah. This changes everything in Scotland, you see. And this is a point that other pundits have not picked up on. Jeremy Corbyn is the only person who can turn things around for Labour in Scotland, can stop independence. Therefore, Jeremy Corbyn is the only politician who can stop Britain breaking up. That's a pretty powerful reason to support him. Because at a stroke, he'll take all those clothes back from the SNP. Yeah. They'll be to the right of the Labour Party, suddenly. They'll be the yellow Tories, rather than Labour being the red Tories. Yeah. It really is an absolute game changer. It's a paradigm shift.
If Corbyn does get in, and we've got to think of second votes, we've got to think of the possibilities of the Blairites acting together in song, but it's the only man that ironically can save the Union is a traditional dyed-in-the-wool left-winger like Jeremy Corbyn. It says a lot of the state of the Union at the moment.
Hallelujah. James Randolph, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's right then, Gayatri?
About the battle for milk, I asked farmers versus supermarkets, which side do you stand on? Dovra says they should all go vegan and no one has to fight over milk that is produced for the calf. David Taylor says, tough choices. Farmers subsidized up to the eyeballs. Why treat them differently to other benefit claimants?
Because if they didn't work, we'd all starve?
On Blair, where is he heading? Ricardo Picasso says he tried his best to kill the Labour Party and now he's complaining about the life support machine. And Muichi says you can have any color you want as long as it's blue.
Well, Blair is the big story this week. Indeed, many weeks. He's the big story. He's clearly not left the political stage. My guess is he intends to come back right at the centre of it. We'll see.
And that's all that we've got for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.